9 p.m. Primetime.
Imagine a television show that didn't just chase ratings, but walked straight into one of the darkest corners of the internet and brought the predators hiding there into the spotlight. Now imagine the man standing in front of the camera, confronting them face to face, becoming one of the most recognizable figures in investigative television. That is the story behind Primetime 2026, an upcoming American psychological crime thriller that takes us back to the origins of one of television's most controversial and unforgettable investigations, To Catch a Predator. And honestly, this movie has the potential to be seriously intense. Directed by Lance Oppenheim in his narrative feature film debut and written by Ajaan Singh, Primetime dives into the real-world story behind the television phenomenon that shocked audiences and sparked huge debates about journalism, morality, entertainment, and the limits of investigative television. And this is where things get really interesting. We usually associate Pattinson with dramatic, mysterious, or larger-than-life characters, but here he steps into the role of a real journalist who became famous for confronting suspected child predators during sting operations. In 2006, television journalism was about to enter a completely different and controversial era. Chris Hansen, a determined investigative journalist working with Dateline NBC, was preparing for an assignment unlike anything he had done before. His goal was to expose people suspected of targeting minors through an undercover sting operation. But what began as a television investigation would soon become a nationwide phenomenon, changing the way audiences looked at crime, journalism, and reality television. Chris Hansen, played by Robert Pattinson, is presented as a journalist who understands the enormous power of television. He knows that a powerful story can expose wrongdoing, but he also understands that once cameras start rolling, the situation can become unpredictable. With the support of his production team, Hansen begins developing a sting operation designed to lure suspected predators into a controlled location. Hidden cameras are positioned throughout the house, while actors and members of the production team help create the appearance of an ordinary meeting. Among the people involved in the operation is Dan Plum, a young, aspiring actor who becomes part of the elaborate setup. For the production team, every detail has to look convincing. The location must appear normal, conversations have to feel natural, and the cameras must remain hidden. But behind the carefully designed environment is a serious investigation with potentially dangerous consequences. Nobody knows exactly what will happen when the suspects arrive. Then, the first person walks through the door. The atmosphere immediately changes. What had previously been a television production suddenly becomes a real confrontation. The production team watches carefully as the suspect enters the house, believing he's meeting someone underage. Cameras quietly capture every movement while the team waits for the right moment. Hansen knows that this is the moment his investigation has been building toward, but he also knows that one mistake could put people at risk. Eventually, Hansen steps forward. The confrontation becomes the defining moment of the investigation. Instead of a traditional police officer making an arrest, viewers see a television journalist sitting across from the suspect and asking direct questions about what brought him there. The tension comes not from an action sequence, but from the uncomfortable silence, the awkward explanations, and the realization that the cameras have captured everything. As more sting operations take place, the investigation begins attracting enormous public attention. What started as an investigative segment is becoming something much bigger. Millions of viewers are watching. Television executives are paying attention, and the production team realizes that they may have created one of the most powerful and controversial programs in television history. But success comes with a price. Behind the cameras, Chris Hansen begins facing increasing pressure. Every new investigation means more preparation, more risks, and more responsibility. The production team has to coordinate actors, locations, surveillance equipment, journalists, and law enforcement, while ensuring that the operation does not collapse. The bigger the program becomes, the more difficult it becomes to separate journalism from television entertainment. Hansen's producer stands beside him throughout this increasingly intense journey. Together, they discuss the risks, the ethical questions, and the growing attention surrounding the investigations. They know the work is exposing people accused of targeting children, but they also understand that millions of people are watching the confrontations as entertainment. The question becomes unavoidable. When does investigative journalism stop being journalism and start becoming a television spectacle? At home, Hansen's professional obsession begins affecting his personal life as well. His wife, Mary Joan Hansen, sees the pressure building around him. The television audience sees only the confident journalist standing in front of the camera, but behind that image is a man dealing with stress, responsibility, and the consequences of becoming the face of a controversial national phenomenon. Meanwhile, the production team continues receiving suspects at the Sting House. Each encounter is different. Some suspects appear nervous, others attempt to explain their actions. Some immediately realize that something has gone terribly wrong when Hansen enters the room. For the journalists and producers, every confrontation creates another difficult question about how these encounters should be presented to the public. The attention surrounding the program grows rapidly. News organizations discuss it, viewers debate it, critics question its methods. Supporters argue that the investigations are exposing people who might otherwise remain hidden. The show becomes a cultural phenomenon, and Chris Hansen becomes a recognizable television personality. But behind the success lies a darker reality. The more successful the investigations become, the more pressure there is to keep producing bigger stories. Television thrives on attention, and attention creates ratings. Ratings create money and influence. Suddenly, the investigation isn't simply about one journalist trying to expose criminals. It has become part of a much larger television machine. Chris begins to understand that he has created something he can no longer completely control. The same cameras that were originally intended to document investigations are now recording moments that millions of people want to watch. The suspects are no longer anonymous. Hansen himself is becoming famous. The program's confrontations are being discussed across the country, and the line between public service and entertainment becomes increasingly blurred. This is where the psychological side of the story becomes more powerful. Hansen has to ask himself whether the attention is helping the mission or changing it. Is television exposing dangerous people because it is the right thing to do, or because audiences cannot look away? Can a journalist remain objective when his investigation has become a major ratings success? At the same time, law enforcement becomes an important part of the operation. The Sting investigations can lead to arrests, transforming television footage into real criminal cases. For the production team, this is the moment when the consequences become unmistakably real. What happens inside the Sting House doesn't end when the cameras stop recording. People can face arrest, prosecution, and the destruction of their public reputation. And for Hansen, every confrontation becomes another test of his judgment. As the story moves forward, Primetime explores the complicated world surrounding the origins of To Catch a Predator. It isn't simply a story about catching criminals. It is also about ambition, television power, ethical boundaries, public fascination, and the psychological cost of turning real investigations into entertainment. Chris Hansen stands at the center of it all. In front of the cameras, he appears calm and confident. Behind them, however, the pressure continues to grow. His career is changing, his personal life is being affected, and the program he helped create is becoming larger than anyone originally expected. Eventually, Hansen has to confront the biggest question of all. What happens when the story becomes bigger than the journalist telling it? Primetime uses this real-world television phenomenon to explore the complicated relationship between crime and entertainment. It shows how one investigative idea can transform into a national obsession, while also forcing the audience to question the consequences of watching real people confronted, exposed, and arrested on television. At its heart, the story is about a journalist who wanted to make television history, and succeeded. But history rarely comes without consequences. Behind every camera is a story. Behind every television screen is an audience, and behind every shocking investigation is a question about where the line should be drawn. That is what makes Primetime such an intriguing story for 2026. It isn't only asking who was caught on camera, it is asking what happens to journalism when the camera itself becomes part of the story. What truly makes Primetime 2026 stand out is that it isn't just another crime thriller about catching criminals. The film takes a real and controversial chapter of television history and puts the spotlight on the man behind the camera. By focusing on Chris Hansen and the origins of To Catch a Predator, the story has the potential to explore the uncomfortable space where journalism, crime, entertainment, public outrage, and television ratings collide. Another major strength is Robert Pattinson as Chris Hansen. Seeing Pattinson step away from the kind of roles audiences usually associate him with and portray a real-life investigative journalist immediately gives the project a different identity. The challenge isn't simply to imitate Hansen's appearance or mannerisms, it is to capture the pressure of confronting dangerous individuals while simultaneously dealing with producers, cameras, ratings, public expectations, and the consequences of turning real investigations into television. The 2006 setting could also give the movie a distinctive atmosphere. This was a time when television news still had enormous cultural influence, the internet was rapidly changing the way people communicated, and social media had not yet completely transformed the media landscape. That period allows Primetime to recreate a fascinating world of old-school newsrooms, hidden cameras, surveillance equipment, television studios, and a rapidly evolving digital culture. But perhaps the most interesting thing about Primetime is its moral complexity. The basic mission of exposing people who target children is obviously serious, but the film can ask uncomfortable questions about what happens when those investigations become hugely successful television entertainment. Where does journalism end and entertainment begin? Can exposing criminals also become a ratings machine? And what happens to the journalist when the story itself becomes bigger than the investigation? That psychological tension could make Primetime much more than a straightforward biographical movie. Instead of simply showing viewers what happened, the film has the opportunity to make them question what they are watching and why they are watching it. If Lance Oppenheim explores those uncomfortable contradictions, rather than presenting everything as simply black and white, the movie could become a genuinely thought-provoking thriller. And finally, the fact that this is Lance Oppenheim's narrative feature debut makes the project even more intriguing. He is taking an already fascinating true story and turning it into a cinematic drama with Robert Pattinson at its center. If the filmmaking successfully combines the tension of a crime thriller with the emotional complexity of a character-driven drama, Primetime could stand out as one of the more unusual and compelling biographical films of 2026. The supporting cast also makes this project even more interesting. Merritt Weber plays Chris's producer, while Skylar Gisondo acts by Dan Plum, a young, aspiring actor hired for the show's sting operations. Anna Faris plays Mary Joan Hansen, Chris's wife. The cast also includes Bokeem Woodbine, Matthew Maher, Phoebe Bridgers, Jonathan Lipnicki, Sean Bridgers, Tony Revolori, Creed Bratton, and Jeff Zucker appearing as himself. And that lineup suggests that the movie isn't going to focus exclusively on Hansen. We're likely to see the people behind the production, the pressure inside the newsroom, the personal consequences, and the complicated machinery required to turn real investigations into television. The story is based on Luke Dittrich's book, Tonight on Dateline, This Man Will Die, which explores the world surrounding the To Catch a Predator phenomenon. And that's another reason this movie could be much deeper than a standard crime thriller. Because the audience already knows the basic concept. We know there is a sting operation. We know suspects arrive. We know Hansen confronts them. But the mystery isn't necessarily what happens. The mystery is how the television machine gets there. What does it take to create a show like this? What happens when exposing criminals becomes a massive ratings success? And what happens when the line between public service and entertainment becomes increasingly difficult to see? That's where Primetime could become genuinely uncomfortable. The film belongs to the genres of action, biography, crime, drama, and psychological thriller, which is an unusual combination. And if the filmmakers balance those elements correctly, we could get a movie that feels less like a conventional police investigation and more like a tense behind-the-scenes descent into the world of television crime reporting. Visually, the 2006 setting also gives the movie plenty of potential. Think old television studios, CRT monitors, early internet culture, newsroom chaos, handheld cameras, dark suburban houses, hidden surveillance equipment, and that unmistakable mid-2000s atmosphere. The contrast could be fascinating: bright television lights on one side and a deeply disturbing reality hiding behind them. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Primetime will be its moral ambiguity, because catching people who intend to harm children is obviously a serious public interest issue. But when those investigations are filmed, edited, broadcast, promoted, and transformed into television entertainment, complicated questions inevitably appear. Is it journalism? Is it entertainment? Is it justice? Or is it all of these things at the same time? That tension could give Robert Pattinson's character far more depth than simply portraying a heroic television host. And that's what I'm personally most curious about. Will Primetime simply celebrate Chris Hansen and the success of To Catch a Predator, or will it also examine the darker consequences and controversies surrounding the phenomenon? If Lance Oppenheim manages to explore both sides, this could become a surprisingly thought-provoking crime thriller. And let's not forget, this is being positioned as Oppenheim's narrative feature film debut. That's a major opportunity. A real-life story involving television, crime, psychology, media pressure, and moral controversy gives a first-time narrative filmmaker an enormous playground. The biggest challenge will be maintaining tension without turning real and disturbing subject matter into cheap entertainment. If the movie gets that balance right, Primetime could be one of the more intriguing biographical thrillers of 2026. The runtime is expected to be around 110 minutes, and the movie is currently scheduled for release on September 25, 2026 in the United States. So is Primetime worth keeping on your watch list? For me, absolutely. Not simply because Robert Pattinson is playing Chris Hansen, not simply because it's based on a famous television phenomenon, but because the story gives filmmakers the opportunity to explore something much bigger. What happens when the pursuit of truth becomes television? When cameras are rolling, ratings are rising, and real criminals are standing on the other side of the door, how much does the journalist control the story? And how much does the story start controlling the journalist? That is the question that could make Primetime much more than another crime thriller. It could become a tense examination of journalism, television, obsession, morality, and the dark side of America's fascination with true crime. And if Robert Pattinson delivers the kind of grounded and psychologically intense performance this role demands, we might be looking at a very different side of the actor. So Primetime 2026 is definitely a movie to keep an eye on. A real story, a controversial television phenomenon, a fascinating lead performance, a psychological crime thriller atmosphere, and a filmmaker taking on his first narrative feature. What more could you ask for? But now, I want to know what you think. Are you excited to see Robert Pattinson as Chris Hansen? And do you think Primetime should focus more on the investigation itself or on the controversial relationship between crime, journalism, and television entertainment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this upcoming movie update, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to CheezeDrama for more upcoming movie updates, trailers, cast news, reviews, explanations, and everything happening in the world of cinema.